music genius, fashion guru, the man's talents were endless. Now, BBC Two pays tribute to the legend that was Malcolm McLaren.
It was here in the King's Road that the comfortably complacent world of the early 1970s was rudely disrupted by an art student and his dressmaker girlfriend, Vivienne Westwood. The world first heard the name Malcolm McLaren a good few years before the invention of punk and the chaotic debut of the Sex Pistols. I met Malcolm a decade later, in the early 1980s, and like so many others, I fell under the spell of the artful dodger, captivated by his charm and intelligence, and the enormous satisfaction he took in provoking and unsettling us all. The legendary manager of the Sex Pistols died 2 weeks ago at the age of 64.
Though there's this incredible myth that dominates the industry about me as being this super kind of Fagin-esque, mythical sort of charlatan, it's just nonsense. I think it was all a posture that they actually believed. You know, maybe I was just a fine actor, but ultimately, you know, one continually mismanaged things because it just was more attractive to mismanage than manage.
Yeah, I mean, he was a great enabler. You know, he enabled me and the other guys in the band to do what we wanted to do. But he didn't know when to stop, and he wanted to keep everything in a state of flux continually all the time.
And we don't care! Because we didn't give a damn whether we were big, small or anything. We just did what we wanted to do, and that was it.
He was a revolutionary. He was somebody that encouraged people through his stories to jump into the brink. Now, sometimes he might trick you to jump in there. And if that didn't work, sometimes he'd just bloody push you in there.
Hey, come on, let's start a big ring!
He was great in that he knew how to choose the moment and choose the sound and choose the look that was needed and put it all together and send it out there. He could create an explosion. He was like someone who lobbed a hand grenade into the middle of the music industry every time he needed to.
We never saw him. Couldn't ever get him on the phone. I don't know what sort of manager he was. He was a sort of a myth.
He was someone who could never truthfully have any malice towards anyone. He could hurt people, like a brat, like a child, but it was never with any intention to harm. And he was very naive in one sense, too. He really believed that everybody was good, everybody was kind.
You know, everything you did, you were always wanting to sort of tip the table over. You were always concerned with creating the chaos.
McLaren was born in North London, a year after the end of the Second World War, brought up by his grandmother, the once wealthy daughter of Jewish diamond dealers in Stoke Newington.
He really learnt from his grandmother the skills of how to tell, how to concoct a story and be able to completely immerse himself and therefore immerse other people around him into that story and to get them to believe it. And certainly as a child, Ben and I, you know, in bed, him telling us all these stories, it was fascinating, it was so exciting, you know, we didn't ever want it to end.
He didn't quite understand people, and because he came from a family without any love, frankly, and who had abandoned him for the most part. His mother had abandoned him. She never spoke to him, she never addressed him, she never looked at him. He was just tolerated.
He didn't really have anything to do with his mother. He was isolated from her by his grandmother. And I remember one time that he told us that he'd got on the tube train and actually sat next to her or opposite her, and neither of them had said a word to each other, and he got off the train and came back and told us this story, you know, so quite sad really, and certainly I think something that affected his outlook with regard to family or understanding family things.
He never really understood people, and he always had in his life a sense of expecting people to abandon him, disappoint him. And that was something that was very hard for him to deal with.
He'd read like Jane Eyre by the time he was 6 years old or something. And so when he went to school and they gave him Peter and Jane books to read, he thought they were all imbeciles and would scream and shout and spend most of the lessons actually on the floor underneath the tables, looking up all the girls' skirts and looking at their legs and things, which he found fascinating. In the end, his grandmother took him out of there and he had home tutors. And so I think, in addition to a kind of strange family upbringing, he also, in a way, sort of failed to learn some of the social skills that kids perhaps learn in the playground, you know, and therefore made up his own rules.
But the problem was Malcolm, although he was great ability, got charisma, he was not taught at all to ever follow rules. His grandmother, in fact, had instructed him as a very small child never to follow the rules, never listen to the teacher. She had taught him to be quite belligerent and encouraged that and thought it was very funny. And so he was never given the training or the education to be able to follow rules.
Throughout the 1960s, Malcolm flitted from art school to art school, always on the lookout for new ideas and adventures. He was excited by the social revolution happening in Paris in 1968 and inspired by the rebellious French philosophy of situationism, which encouraged its followers to reinvent themselves and reject the status quo by staging uprisings and events.
I was very, very lost. When one was finally thrown out and had to enter the real world, that real world was the dawn of the 70s for me and many others like me. And we were all incredibly shocked by the fact there was nothing to do. I personally at that time literally felt like I was living in a hole in the ground and barely left the little apartment I was living in at that time with my school teacher girlfriend, Vivian Westwood. I felt I had to make a statement. That was the whole point. How could I go on an adventure and not have a career? How could I follow the precepts of this sense of, hey, learn how to be a magnificent failure. Learn how to disrupt and become fearless. Challenge the world.
Teddy Boy thing and all of that for me was all about the idea of being a peacock, you know, and standing out in the crowd, but at the same time feeling a sense that you are part of the dispossessed, which at the end of my art school term I thought I could make a profit by if I created a scene in the most fashionable quarter of London at the time, the King's Road, a scene that would be a counterpoint to what was going on, which was still the remnants of dandy fashions and that 60s look of velvet loons and so on.
McLaren's scene was a shop at the wrong end of fashionable King's Road. He and his girlfriend, dressmaker Vivian Westwood, called it Let It Rock,